hyper beam hits a building. That's a heat blast close to a small historical atomic bomb. A Giga Impact. A shockwave in the same range as one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded. And that residual aura from a legendary, the one you can still measure weeks after a battle. It looks a lot like something humanity already knows, something we still haven't managed to erase, almost 40 years later. So in this video, we're not just gonna say a legendary battle. First number, the energy of a hyper beam. To locally melt structural steel, you need around 2000 degrees, sustained for several seconds in a beam as wide as a bus. Translate that into released energy, and a single hit at that power gets into the same order of magnitude as a historical atomic bomb, think Hiroshima. About 60,000 billion joules. That's not a writer's exaggeration. That's literally the unit scientists used to describe the energy of a. Here's something engineers have known for a long time and building codes account for precisely. Steel doesn't need to melt to fail. Look at the fire resistance curves used in construction everywhere. A steel beam already loses half its strength around 600 degrees. That's 3 times lower than its melting point. And that loss isn't even. The surface takes the thermal shock, the core stays cooler for a few seconds, which creates internal tension, a thermal gradient, and that. There's a real, documented phenomenon in construction called spontaneous tempered glass breakage. Tiny invisible inclusions in the glass, caused by manufacturing heat, can keep growing for years after a window's installed, until it shatters with no visible impact, sometimes in the middle of the night, nobody around. A thermal shock as brutal as a hyper beam massively speeds up that process. A skyscraper that got hit can look completely fine for days, before collapsing. Giga Impact transfers into the ground an energy comparable to a localized earthquake. For a real-world scale, the Tohoku earthquake in 2011, one of the most powerful ever recorded on Earth, released so much energy it actually shifted the planet's axis slightly and shortened the length of the day by a few microseconds. A Giga Impact concentrates a fraction of that energy onto a tiny area, a few dozen meters, instead of hundreds of kilometers of fall. And we already have a real case study for this. The Northridge earthquake in California in 1994. The shaking caused hundreds of pipe bursts within hours. Across the entire city of Los Angeles, flooded streets, whole neighborhoods without water for days. And that earthquake was only a fraction of the intensity you'd associate with a Giga Impact. Rigid pipes snap outright under ground torsion, even flexible ones, designed to absorb small movements. This phenomenon has a name and famous photos to prove it: soil liquefaction. In 1964 in Japan, during the Niigata earthquake, entire buildings literally tipped over sideways, almost intact, just because the waterlogged ground under their foundations lost all its bearing capacity. The same thing hit Christchurch, New Zealand in 2011. These aren't disaster movie scenarios. They're real cases, studied in every civil engineering school. A Giga Impact. So this whole thing about a residual aura that never fully drops back to zero, does that have a real equivalent? Yes. And it has a name everyone knows: Chernobyl. Almost 40 years after the 1986 disaster, the 30-kilometer exclusion zone is still today measurably radioactive. The red forest right next to the plant had its trees die and turn red within days, and the soil there is still contaminated enough that nothing comparable has grown back. The extreme temperature swings created by a clash between opposite types also have a real precedent. In 1991, the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines sent enough particles into the atmosphere to drop the global average temperature by about half a degree for over a year. On a local scale, a fight between fire and ice attacks would create the same kind of concentrated climate shock: artificial fog, pockets of extreme heat or cold. Back to Chernobyl's red forest. Decades after the disaster, some areas of soil still contain cesium and strontium concentrations way above normal, enough to stop the original vegetation from fully coming back. That's exactly the mechanism you'd see after a legendary battle: elements pulled up from deep soil layers or leftover residue from the energy itself, turning a park into a semi-permanent wasteland. Two versions of the same city. The one before, full of fame. The answer already exists in real form in the most seismically active zones on the planet. Tokyo, San Francisco, Wellington, These cities enforce some of the strictest earthquake building codes in the world. Floating foundations, structures that absorb movement instead of resisting it, facades designed to limit flying debris. In areas most exposed to legendary battles, that logic would go even further. Less glass, more concrete, semi-underground structures. This stop. And to absorb a shockwave at this scale, a real technology already exists: the tuned mass damper. Taipei 101 in Taiwan has one on public display, a 660-ton steel sphere hanging like a giant pendulum near the top of the tower, counterbalancing sway from typhoons and earthquakes. Under certain neighborhoods rebuilt after a legendary battle, buried versions of that same tech could absorb part of a shockwave before it reaches nearby foundations. And that's where the economics of the whole system would start cracking too, because that part isn't even a hypothesis anymore. In California, several of the country's biggest insurers, including State Farm and Allstate, have stopped selling new home policies in recent years, judging wildfire risk too high and too unpredictable to stay profitable. A world where creatures capable of leveling a neighborhood actually existed would push that phenomenon to the extreme. A new, most promising solution already exists in a lab. Researchers at TU Delft in the Netherlands developed a concrete containing dormant bacteria, able to reactivate on contact with water and produce limestone to seal a crack the moment it appears, before it spreads into the kind of delayed collapse we talked about earlier. And for urban battles, another principle already used against wildfires could apply: cleared corridors, buffer zones that deliberately steered. So let's do the math we promised at the start. Energy comparable to a historical bomb, a localized earthquake in the range of the most powerful ever recorded, lasting contamination comparable to Chernobyl 40 years after the fact, a local climate disruption on the scale of a major volcanic eruption, and an insurance system that would crack exactly the way it's already cracking today in real risk zones. A single legendary battle wouldn't just be another fight in a. If this dive into the engineering of chaos was your thing, you know what to do: like, comment, and subscribe. Because next time we're opening another file nobody's ever dared to calculate. See you soon.